Your rights are my responsibility. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. I'm not listening to your stupid classes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Roach, and today we're going to be asking the question, does the modern man need religion? But how we're going to do it is going to be unique. You know, there's a clip that's kind of gone viral all over X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it today, with Joe Rogan talking about this idea of we need Jesus. And what he's talking about is the role of religion in modern society. So what I want to do today is I want to use this as a springboard to have one of those timeless dialogues that we try to have on here. And I want you to really think for yourself. And what I want to do is I want to talk about issues that relate to the place of religion in the modern world. And can religion in particular explain features of the modern world that non-religious views can't? So I think it's a very straightforward thing that I want to do today. Now, in addition to this, what I want to do is I just want to start out by saying this. This is not a video where we're going to dunk on Rogan. We're going to listen to his clip here in a second. We're not here to mock him or make fun of him. And one of the things I want you to see is this, is that Rogan is really dealing with one of the central questions on one of the central issues that has really just plagued all of humanity from the dawn of time until now. And I want to give you an example of this before we jump into it. I have this long series that's in my library downstairs. It's a 60-volume series. It's called the Great Books Series. And it was edited by a University of Chicago professor named Mortimer Adler. In that, there are 58 volumes of original literature that cover everything from, you know, history, science, philosophy, theology, and all the rest, from the pre-Socratics all the way up to really just the contemporary era. But here's one of the keys. In that, it has a 2-volume thing called the Syntopicon. And there are 100 articles. And within those 100 articles, it lays out a huge outline and discusses several issues related to all of these key questions. Like, what about justice? You know, what about law? What about all of these different things? But one of the key things that it talks about is the topic of God and the question of God. And here's what's most interesting. If you look at all of the articles that are in that particular Syntopicon, the longest one is on the question of God. And you ask yourself, why would that one be the longest question? Well, the answer to it is very clear. It's because it's the most important question. It's literally the question of questions in that sense. Every person either has to deal with the question of God either by accepting it, rejecting it, modifying it. There's, you know, all these different expressions on the question. And one of the reasons when asked and pressed about it, they said it's because it is the most important question. So with that caveat, I want you to realize that what we're dealing with here has historically been deemed the question of questions. So let's just dive right in to this conversation here. So what I want you to see is that one of the reasons that I saw this is that Jordan Peterson actually brought it up. And he said, "See you soon, Joe." And this figure's talking about how there's been this big shift in the life of Joe Rogan. Namely, if you followed Rogan, which I have, I love Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan's one of my favorite podcasters that's out there. In fact, I love Rogan not only because of his podcast, but because we're both martial artists. He may be a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We both have, you know, striking backgrounds and all the rest. So there's a lot of things I really like about Joe Rogan in that regard. In fact, I've always joked that if I ever have to use my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I hope that it gets captured on video and that Joe Rogan will commentate it somewhere on Twitter or something like that. So Joe, if you're watching this, that's one of my goals in life. But, you know, if you've followed Joe Rogan, you've noticed that he's been on a journey, and we're all on a journey in this regard. And one of the things that you've seen is that Rogan was very antagonistic to religion. He saw a lot of issues with religion broadly understood, but yet you see a shift that's taking place in this clip. And, you know, Jordan Peterson probably was the one that brought it to my attention. I've seen it a little bit for the last few days, but I decided to commentate on it. So let's just play the clip and then we'll discuss the particular issue. So with no further ado, here we go.
But I think as time rolls on, people are going to understand the need to have some sort of divine structure to things, some sort of belief in the sanctity of love and of truth. And a lot of that comes from religion. A lot of people's moral compass and the guidelines that they've used to follow to live a just and righteous life has come from religion. And unfortunately, a lot of very intelligent people, they dismiss all of the positive aspects of religion because they think that the stories are mere superstitious fairy tales, that they have no place in this modern world, and we're inherently good and your ethics are based on your old moral compass and we all have one. And that's not necessarily true. We need Jesus. I think, for real. Like, if he came back now, it'd be great. Like, Jesus, if you're thinking about coming back
right now,
now's a good time.
Yeah, pretty soon. Yeah,
now's a good time.
And which I would thoroughly agree. So let's just dive into this a little bit more. So, a few of the things that you look at with Joe Rogan is he's talking about a few topics here. The first one is, as time rolls on, people will need a divine structure to things. So we're really asking, what's the place of God for explaining the world in which we live? And then he also goes on to talk about other issues related to the sanctity of love and truth. And if we look at anything, people will say, well, love is love. But what we realize is that not all expressions of love are truly love in the life of an individual. There's been a lot of damage done to people in the name of love. And we've also recognized that even religious people have done a lot of damage to people in the name of love. So we're not trying to deal with something like this. The other thing is that you look at what he talks about, that a lot of good can come from religion on how it teaches people to live a just and righteous life. And I think what is important here is that it sort of does away with the whole argument that religious people have nothing to bring to the table, that they're immoral people, that they're bigoted people, and all the rest. Now, we recognize there are people who are religious that are like that. But you also find that if consistent, people are not necessarily always going to be like that when they're religious. And what I want to do is I want to look a little bit more into what can actually ground this concept of morality. So we're going to have a little bit more of a philosophical conversation here in just a second. In fact, that's my background, and that's why we have this channel. Many of the people who follow me want to have this kind of conversation at a deeper level. And then the final thing that he looks at is this idea of just objections that people have, miracles in the modern mind. Can these miracles that you talk about, can they actually occur within this scientific world? Or aren't the stories that are recorded nothing more than myths and fairy tales? Or aren't we just inherently good? So why would I need religion? I do some bad things, but why would I inherently need religion? Interestingly enough, the history of the Christian church has talked about this, and that was historically known as Pelagianism. In addition to it, isn't the idea of morality that they give just dated, that the moral compass is off on these people? They argue for all of these concepts that the modern world wouldn't believe today. So with that, what I want to do is I want to deal with a few of these. And the first one that I want to look at is this idea that as time rolls on, people will need a divine structure to things. And what I want to do is I want to explain what that could mean and what it historically means in the arena of philosophy of religion. And what it is that we find that there are features of the world in which we live. You go outside and you see change and you see unity. You see things begin to exist and they cease to exist. You see things live in time and that there's contingency. Not only do they begin to exist and they cease to exist, but there's causes that bring them about, and sometimes causes that cause them to cease to exist. Or there are degrees of perfection. We realize that you can have two different types of people trying to do the same thing, and one is just inherently better. Well, how can something be inherently better or worse if there's not a standard? And what these are is that there's a question of what ultimately grounds these kinds of things. And by grounds, it means what provides the foundation for not only their existence, but the best explanation for them. And this is what ultimately becomes an issue of worldview thinking. And worldview thinking is trying to deal with things related to how people actually view and understand the world, and which one gives the best explanation of the features that are taking place within the world. So here are a few topics that people might talk about within worldview studies, like where did I come from? Who am I? How shall I live? And where am I going? And we see the different ones that can come. The Christian theist is going to say, where did I come from? God created me. The non-religious, maybe the atheist or something, is going to say, well, maybe I don't know, but most likely we've either been here forever, some kind of eternal concept, or if there was a beginning, it came about through evolution. You're going to see things about who am I? Am I just an evolved sort of animal in this regard, or am I somebody that's made in the image of God? How shall I live? One is going to say according to the moral law and the revelation of God. Another could really just say, well, however you want. Might makes right, or maybe there are objective morals, yet I don't have the right to press them on you. And we know some of these, and then ultimately, where are we going? What happens after we die in that regard? Now, some of the other things that people are going to look at would be things like I said, how do we explain features of causality and change, the beginning of the universe, issues related to design? Is there an inherent feature of the world that is designed? And can the world in and of itself explain that element of design? Where does the concept of truth come from? Can truth be something that's objective for all people at all places and at all times if there's nothing that is in us that can give rise to such a characteristic? Because we're in time, we're changing, we're not something that's cross-cultural. You're very much located here in your time, your place, your culture. Well, what can ground that? Christians have always said the nature of God and God himself, the concept of morality, consciousness. And another thing that's interesting is that there's also these issues of like fulfillment of desires. You know, I have the desire for something to drink. I have the desire for something to eat. I have the desire for, they'll say sex and procreation. And when you look at these things, there is a true fulfillment to these real desires. Like there's water to drink, there's food to eat, and sex is fulfilled. It's one of the aspects of what has been given to us in this regard. So then the question comes down to like, I have these real desires and they're met in this world, and yet millions upon millions and billions upon billions of people have this desire for God. And it would seem just very inconsistent that all of these other desires that we have, and we'll say good desires that people have in that regard, because people can have crazy, stupid desires too, but good, necessary, essential desires have a real fulfillment. And yet this good desire of all that God could bring would not have that type of fulfillment. And what these are saying is that this idea that Rogan says, as time rolls on, the divine structure, there's a need for it. Yeah, there's a need for explaining the fulfillment of desires or aesthetic experiences or religious experiences or conscious morality, the concept of truth, causality, all of these different things. So I really just agree with him on this first point that he's giving, is that, yeah, I mean, when you look at the differences that come about, you see a lot of issues that non-Christian views have in order to both ground and explain those types of things. Another way of putting it is that there seems to be something inadequate within their worldview that can give rise to just coherence in between these. And there was a figure within 20th century thought. His name was Francis Schaeffer. And Francis Schaeffer used to talk about everybody has a worldview. Can you account for your worldview? And can you account for these real features within the real world? And he would talk about things like this could be an example that we could give. So you don't believe in objective morality, or you think that morality is subjective and there's nothing more that can be given to it. And you live in this world. And let's just say hypothetically, you are going into a coffee shop or a restaurant or a bar or something like that. And as you're going in there, somebody steals your wallet and they run off with it. And we know what they're going to do. They're going to go take your money or charge your cards or do whatever they're going to do. And you get livid ticked off. You realize that something was objectively done that's wrong to you, both in your reaction and in what you want done to that person. So you call the cops, you chase the guy down, you pummel his face in, you do something like that. Whatever happens, you feel like justice needs to take place here. But can the non-Christian worldview account for this? And, there are a lot of people who say that it cannot account for it. And this is what Schaeffer would have talked about as exposing a worldview, taking the roof off of a worldview, because here's sort of the two cousins that are living in antagonism with one another. There are no objective moral wrongs, and yet this guy did an objective moral wrong by stealing from me or whatever thing that we come up with. How can they both be true at the same time in the same sense? They can't. So what it does is it exposes something. Either this is objectively not wrong, hence justice doesn't need to be done, your reaction was overbearing, uncalled for, and so forth, or it is objectively morally wrong, and yet you're living with this inconsistency. We see what goes on here. So we could talk about a lot of these. There's a lot of these different types of situations, but what I want to do is, I don't have time to deal with everything here, but I want to deal with this issue of the moral law and some issues related to consciousness, because I think it's one of the most important. So what we're trying to look at here is we look at this concept of the moral law, and I want to look at a book that's put out by two Boston College philosophy professors on this. But before we do, I want to just have a little bit of a conversation like this. We're asking what best explains features of the world in which we live. In addition, we're asking, can non-theistic and non-religious views ground these moral facts of the universe? Can they actually provide a stable foundation for understanding what they are and how they should operate? Another thing is this. A lot of people get confused in this conversation. Maybe you're one of them. And I want to dispel this myth. We are not saying that non-religious people can't be moral. Clearly, there are non-religious people who do good things. We're not denying that. And what we find is that many of these things they're clearly contrary to, issues that people are claiming. But my point is this, is that we're not saying that they can't be moral in any sense of the word. That's clearly contrary to the known facts of the world and people that we live with. Like, we have crazy uncles that may be atheists who are moral. They do good things. Rather, what we're asking is that, can they account for the morality that they're espousing? Or is it just nothing more than their personal desires? In addition, we are not saying that all religious people are consistently moral. There are a lot of religious people, and you probably know some of them, who are absolute jerks and hypocrites, and they do immoral things all the time. But we are saying this, that apart from them, the worldview that they're espousing best accounts for and grounds morality. That's what we're saying. It's not an issue of the individual particular people. We're saying more than that. We're asking which worldview system can best account for it. So we also recognize this, that when these other views try to ground their morality, it appears to many, and I would say myself included, that they use notoriously subjective standards, to the point that it seems like sometimes they're just making up their standards. And anyone recognizes that if you do this in any other arena of life, you are horribly inconsistent and most likely making it up. Now, I'm not saying these people are just making it up. I think we actually have an explanation for it, namely that they have a conscience, that they're made in the image of God, that these are things that are just sort of cooked into or baked into the nature of humanity. So what we're saying is that what we need to do is give an account for this. And I want to spend the rest of our time sort of dealing with this. And the book that I want to use here is one just titled The Handbook of Christian Apologetics by two Boston College professors. Right here, you can go look it up. And they deal with this issue of the moral argument. And I just kind of want to read through a couple of the things that they have to say, make a couple of comments, and we'll be done here. So it says this. This is the argument that they give. Premise 1, real moral obligation is a fact. We are really, truly, objectively obligated to do good and avoid evil. 2, either the atheistic view of reality is correct or the religious one. 3, but the atheistic one is incompatible with there being moral obligation. 4, therefore, the religious view of reality is correct. So this is the argument that they're laying out here. Which one is the correct one and which one is compatible with this idea of moral obligation? So let's start out here and listen to what they're saying here. We need to be clear about what the first premise is claiming. It does not mean merely that we can find people around who claim to have certain duties, nor does it mean that there have been many people who thought they were obligated to do things like clothing the naked and to avoid doing others like committing adultery. The first premise is claiming something more, namely that we human beings really are obligated, that our duties arise from the way things really are and not simply from our desires or subjective dispositions. It is claiming, in other words, that moral values or obligations themselves, and not merely the belief in moral values, are objective facts. So the point is this, is that objective facts that exist in this sense are like any other facts of the world, like 2 + 2 = 4, a real objective fact. Or this thing is 25 inches long, a real objective fact. And what we're saying is that morality, while different in some sense, is just as objective as those features of the world. And when you look at the first premise, they're not saying that these are just, you have desires about them or subjective dispositions about them, that these are real moral obligations, that you are actually called to them and they are real moral facts of the world. Now it goes on to say this. Now, given the fact of moral obligation, a question naturally arises. Does the picture of the world presented by atheism accord with this fact? They say this. The answer is no. Atheists never tire of telling us that we are the chance products of motion of matter, a motion which is purposeless and blind to every human striving. We should take them at their word and ask, given this picture, in what exactly is the moral good rooted? Moral obligation can hardly be rooted in a material motion blind to purpose. And one figure explains this with this kind of analogy. If we are nothing more than molecules colliding and motion and matter, and that's all that we are, how do we get morality from it? And he likens it to this. What if I had a can of Pepsi and a can of Mountain Dew and I shake them up? And we know what happens. They're going to fizz all over. So we crack them open and they start fizzing from this. Would we say that you can get objective morality from that kind of matter in motion that's taking place, this chemical reaction that's taking place with Pepsi and Mountain Dew? The answer would be no. But as we recognize, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If we are nothing more than matter and motion, maybe greater features of matter and motion, maybe we're not just Pepsi and Mountain Dew cans that are there, but we're these human beings, but nonetheless reduced into what we are at our core. We're just matter and motion. If we can't get morality from that matter and motion, why can we get morality from this particular matter and motion? And what the authors here are trying to say is that if we're going to take the atheists at their word and be charitable to what they're saying and be honest with what many of their top philosophers and their key thinkers would say, then there's really no grounding for the objective moral facts of the universe. So let's look at this. They go on to say this. Suppose we say it is rooted in nothing deeper than human willing and desire, meaning this moral fact. In that case, we have no moral standard against which human desires can be judged, for every desire will spring from the same ultimate source, purposeless, pitiless matter. And what becomes of obligation? According to this view, if I say there's an obligation to feed the hungry, I would be stating a fact about my wants and desires and nothing else. In addition, they say, I would be saying that I want to feed, or I want the hungry to be fed, and that I choose to act on that desire. But this amounts to an admission that neither I nor anyone else is really obligated to feed the hungry, that in no fact, no one has any real obligation at all. Therefore, the atheistic view of reality is not compatible with there being a genuine moral obligation. So what is compatible, they ask? One that sees real moral obligation as grounded in its creator, that sees moral obligation as rooted in the fact that we have been created with a purpose and for an end, a telos, the purpose for which something is made in the Aristotelian sense. We call this view with deliberate generality the religious one, but however general the view, reflection on the fact of moral obligation does seem to confirm it. Now, there's a lot of things that they look at. There's various objections that they look at. And I want to look at just one objection here for the sake of dealing with, because I know a lot of people out there are probably raising these types of objections. Now, they're saying this argument does not or has not shown that ethical subjectivism is false. What if there are no objective values? Good objection, we might say. They say, true enough. The argument assumes that there are objective values. It aims to show that believing in them is incompatible with one picture of the world and quite compatible with another. Those two pictures are the atheistic materialistic one and, broadly speaking, the religious one. Granted, if ethical subjectivism is true, then the argument does not work. However, almost no one is a consistent subjectivist. Note this. Many think they are and say they are until they suffer violence or injustice. The guy steals your wallet. The guy beats you up in a parking lot. In that case, they are invariably stand with the rest of us in recognizing that certain things ought never to be done. They go on to say this, and for the many who are not and never will be subjectivists, the argument can be most helpful. It can show them that to believe as they do in objective values is inconsistent with what they may also believe about the origin and destiny of the universe. If they move to correct the inconsistency, it will be toward the religious view and away from the atheistic view. So here's one of the things that we got to see is this, is that it's not only can you ground these particular features, it's asking this question, are the claims I'm making in this particular area of my life consistent with the claims that I'm making in this other area of my life? So if one area of my life is saying something like this, purposeless chance, subjective desires, and yet objective moral values, where do you get that? Where does it ground that? But if you want to hold on to this idea of objective moral values as a feature of the world that you don't want to give up with, then you need to be consistent with the other one and ask yourself, what is more consistent? You have an objective moral value that can be grounded in the nature of God, that is not changing, that's more than your desires. So what we have to find is that if we want these two competing cousins, we might say, to actually get along with one another, one of them's going to have to change. Either you're going to have to give up the idea of objective moral values and objective morals that are out there, or you're going to have to give up on this purposeless world in which we say that we live, matter, emotion, and so forth. But if we do want to affirm these, the most rational, consistent explanation would be to hold the religious view, to hold the view that's saying that there is a God that gave us a creation, that grounds our morality, and so on and so forth. And this is what we're trying to say here. Again, I was saying, what is the best world, or which worldview best explains the world in which we live? Now, I want to look at just one other little thing here that they say related to this. It says, but we grant that there are many steps to travel from objective moral values to the creator of the universe or the triune God of love. There's a vast intellectual difference between them, but these things are compatible in a way that materialism and belief in objective values are not. To reach a personal creator, you need other arguments. And to reach the God of love, you need revelation. By itself, the argument leaves many options open and eliminates only some, but we are surely well rid of those it does eliminate. So notice, we're not trying to say objective moral values and this argument alone is all we would need to have great, consistent arguments for the existence of God and the things that we're saying about God. What we are saying is that if you want those, we have those arguments and you can go look them up. So this might be something that you're struggling with, and I would encourage you, there's a whole host of literature out there that's dealing with these particular things. Now, I also want to deal with one little thing here as he starts to deal with issues of conscious and subjective morality that people give us today. Like where do these things come from? Are we our own moral compass, as he would say? So the guys say this, the authors say, since moral subjectivism is very popular today, the following version of, or twist to, the moral argument should be effective since it does not presuppose moral objectivism. So here's another angle of this argument. Modern people often say they believe that there are no universally binding moral obligations, that we must all follow our own private conscience. But that very admission is enough of a premise to prove the existence of God. And they say, well, how do we know this? Isn't it remarkable that no one, even the most consistent subjectivists, believe that there is ever good for anyone to deliberately and knowingly disobey his or her conscience? Even if different people's consciences tell them to do or avoid totally different things, there remains one moral absolute for everyone. Never disobey your conscience. And we see how this works in the world today. People are going to say this in different ways. Oh, follow your heart, which is terrible advice. But if your conscience doesn't allow you to do something, to vote for a particular person, or to go to a particular place, or buy a particular product, or whatever it is, people are not going to fault you for following your conscience. In fact, so much of sort of this classical liberal world in which we want to live, not necessarily that we do live, says that you have the freedom to follow your conscience in these regards. So we can't come down upon you for voting for one political party or not, or making particular decisions or not. But one of the things that it's looking at is if we grant that, that gives us one moral absolute, namely, you ought to always follow your conscience or never disobey your conscience. So they go on to say this: where did conscience get such an absolute authority? An authority admitted even by moral subjectivists and relativists. They say there are only 4 possibilities. So where did this thing even come from? 1, from something less than me, nature. 2, from me, the individual. 3, from others equal to me, society. All the people in your community are saying this is what you should believe. Or 4, from something above me, God. So is it from nature, you, society, or God? And they respond to some of these. They say this for the first one. Some of these are very short. How can I be absolutely obligated by something less than me? For example, an animal instinct or practical need for material survival. It seems inherent and very straightforward that if something is less than me, it can't tell me what to do. Like the employee doesn't tell the boss what to do. And nature, which is less than us, remember, in the classical sense of the term, we are rational animals. The rationality and the morality and all the rest dictate what goes on. So how can something less than me, how can a rock tell me what to do? Or how can a tree tell me what to do? How can nature, in and of itself, tell me what to do? We recognize that that's just not the way that the world operates. Or from me, the individual, can you be the grounds of this? They ask this: how can I obligate myself absolutely? Am I absolute? Do I have the right to demand absolute obedience from anyone, even myself? And if I am the one who locked myself in this prison of obligation, I can also let myself out, thus destroying the absoluteness of the obligation which we admitted as our premise. So think about this. Do you have the authority to bind yourself? Would that argument that you should always follow your conscience, can you bind that on another individual? According to subjectivists, no. But look at what they say this. So if I put myself into this moral obligation prison, well, why can't I put myself out of it? If you can jump into the crate, why can you not jump out of the crate? But if you can put yourself in and you can put yourself out, and I know what you're all thinking, put your right foot in, put your right foot out. We destroy the absolute nature of this obligation. If it's not something that's binding on you when you even don't like it, or when it sucks, or you don't like what's going on with it, well, guess what? Then it's not an obligation in that regard. So they move on to this third one. How can society obligate me? What right do my equals have to impose their values on me? Does quantity make quality? Do a million human beings make a relative into an absolute? Is society now functioning like God? And what we recognize here is that, if you add a bunch of individual finite creatures together in that regard, that quantity doesn't give you this specific absolute quality of absolute moral bindings on people. And in addition, we recognize that societies do sometimes just make up morality. And that would be something, well, why didn't they just make up moral obligation in that regard and just impose it on you falsely? And he makes the interesting question here is, would this almost be like making society God? Like you don't have the choice over this. You have to receive whatever you get. Sorry, tough luck. Now, here's what he goes on to say is he says this: the only source of absolute moral obligation left is something superior to me. This binds my will morally with rightful demands for complete obedience. Thus, God or something like God is the only adequate source and ground for the absolute moral obligation we all feel to obey our conscience. Conscience is thus explainable only as the voice of God in the soul. The 10 Commandments are 10 divine footprints in our psychic sand. Now, he goes on to talk about different things about the relationship between religion and morality and how can they be grounded in this regard. And he gives things that, there's all these different possibilities that give. One is that religion and morality may be thought to be independent, or God may be thought of as the inventor of morality, as he is the inventor of birds in this regard, or that the idea that God commands a thing because it is good is also unacceptable because it makes God conform to a law higher than himself, a law that overarches God and humanity alike, or what he's going to say, which is probably the best explanation, the only rationally acceptable answer to the question of the relation between God and morality is the biblical one. Namely, morality is based on God's eternal nature. That is why morality is essentially unchangeable. I am the Lord your God. Sanctify yourself, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. End quote. And they also say our obligation to be just, kind, honest, and loving and righteous goes all the way up to ultimate reality, to the eternal nature of God, to what God is. That is why morality has absolute and unchangeable binding force on our conscience. And it goes on to talk about a whole bunch of different things, and we could look at these. But what I want you to see is this, is that morality and God can't be independent, because what they're going to look at is that an amoral, what they're going to say is this, is that an amoral God is indifferent to morality, would not be a holy, good God. For one of the primary meanings of good involves the moral, just, loving, wise, righteous, holy, and kind. And such a morality not having any connection with God, the absolute being, would not have any absolute reality behind it. So that's why they can't be thought of as independent. In addition, it says God may be thought to be the inventor of morality, like all other things. And they say the moral law is often thought of as simply a product of God's choice. Thus, or this is the divine command theory. A thing is good only because God commands it, and evil because God forbids it. And they respond and say this: if this is all, however, we have a serious problem. God and his morality are arbitrary and based on mere power. If God commanded us to kill innocent people, that would become good, since good here means whatever God commands. The divine command theory reduces to morality to power. And they also look at this, that Socrates refuted this divine command theory pretty conclusively in Plato's Euthyphro. He asked Euthyphro, is a thing pious because the gods will it, or do the gods will it because it's pious? He refuted the first alternative in thought, and he was left with the second only as an alternative. So they deal with that here. But the idea that God commands a thing because it is good is also unacceptable, because it makes God conform to a law higher than himself, a law that overarches God and humanity alike. The God of the Bible is no more separated from moral goodness by being under it than he is by being over it. He no more obeys a higher law that binds him than he creates the law as an artifact that could change and could well have been different, like a planet. So again, they say it's the biblical one. The only rational, acceptable answer to the question of the relationship between God and morality is the biblical one. Morality is based on God's eternal nature. So what I want to do is I just want to finish with this. I know that if you're still with me here, you're probably just a nerd who loves these kinds of things. Welcome to the club. So I want to finish with this because people may use this going forward. I want to get a little bit of what they're saying here, is that the only other possible sources for moral obligation would be my ideals, purposes, aspirations, and desires, something created by my mind or will, like the rules of baseball. This utterly fails to account for why it is always wrong to disobey or change the rules. Another they could say is this: my moral will itself. Some read Kant this way: I impose morality on myself, but how can one bound and thus the one who binds be the same? If the locksmith locks himself in a room, he is not really locked in, for he can also unlock himself. Or another human being may be thought to be the one who imposes morality on me, my parents, for example, but this fails to account for its binding character. If your father commands you to deal drugs, your moral obligation is to disobey him. No human being can have absolute authority over another. We've only got two more here. Society is a popular answer to the question of the origin of morality. This or that specific person is a very unpopular answer. Yet the two are the same. Society only means more individuals. What right do they have to legislate morality to me? Quantity cannot yield quality. Adding numbers cannot change the rules of a relative game to the rightful absolute demand of conscience. And finally, the universe, evolution, natural selection, and survival all fare even worse as explanations for morality. You cannot get more out of less. The principle of causality is violated here. How could primordial slime pools gurgle up the Sermon on the Mount? And, they're going to look at a lot of other little objections here, but the point is that only a good will can demand a good will. Only love can demand love. And what gives us that? It is God in and of himself. So I want to finish on this one little note where Joe Rogan says we all need Jesus. Well, they all need Jesus for this reason. We realize that there is an objective moral law that's out there. God has revealed himself in conscience and in natural law and in the Bible, and we are all law breakers. We have all broken these objective moral standards. We all live utterly inconsistent with them, whether we like it or not. We're all vain hypocrites, lawbreakers, and so forth. But that's why Jesus Christ came. Jesus Christ came to live the perfect life, to fulfill God's righteous requirements from his law. And in doing so, he was in many respects fulfilling what God has called all of us to do. So we all fell in Adam, but we can all be redeemed in Christ. And Jesus Christ lived the perfect life and benefited in righteousness in this regard. But what we have to also find is that Jesus Christ lived a perfect life. He died upon the cross, was buried, and rose again. Well, why would Jesus Christ die upon the cross? And the Bible is very clear about this. Jesus Christ died for our sins upon the cross. Well, what sins? All the sins where we broke God's law. So where we should have been punished in that regard, Jesus Christ was our substitute, and he took our punishment for us. So all of our unrighteous deeds were credited to Jesus Christ, and he paid for them on the cross, where all of his righteousness, all of the good things that he did, the right standing that we could have had, but yet we were lawbreakers, is credited to us by faith in his son. Jesus Christ died because the wages of sin is death, but yet all people united to Christ by faith alone will, not only did we die in him, we rise in him. And he was raised from the dead for our justification, so that we're going to be declared righteous. But if you're not united to Christ and you are not bound together with Christ in that regard by faith and faith alone, then you are left in this situation. If the wages of sin are death, and the death of Christ doesn't cover and atone for your sins, you must cover and atone for your sins. And the reality is that where shall we be going afterwards? For the Christian, it's everlasting life in Christ. For the non-Christian, it's an eternal everlasting hell. I know we may not like hearing that, but what does it mean when it says we need Jesus? That's what we need Jesus Christ for. So again, if you stuck around the whole 42 minutes, this is what's known as the gospel of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ lived a perfect life. He died as a substitute in your place. He was buried. He rose again, and he ascended on high, where he serves as our priest, our great high priest, our intercessor for our justification. And he is returning yet once again. So again, I want to say thank you. I hope you see this as a timeless dialogue, something to think about, and that you need to see that the question of God and the question of who is God and the reality of what that provides for us in this world, namely, as Rogan was talking about, this reality that we all need a divine structure of things, makes sense in this regard. And we can talk about this under a whole host of other topics and a whole host of other individuals. But again, I just want to say, look at it as it relates to the one thing, your conscience and the morality and the things that we find in this world.
A man has to decide that he's going to do something.